Often considered one of the most dominant and offensively stacked teams in the league, the 1998 Minnesota Vikings were a unit that inspired belief within a generation of fans that had experienced a form of suffering unmatched by most. All the trauma and heartbreak they'd endured in the Super Bowl era was enough to drain the hope from any soul. But this team was a break from that. This unique mixture of inexperienced, hungry young talent and well-spoken, mature veterans briefly rejuvenated a populace that seemed as though they had pretty much accepted their fate. And, well, they were pretty good at football too. So good that even with a quarterback change mid-season, they lost no steam. Sadly though, this team is remembered both for being arguably the greatest team ever and the most soul-crushing of them all. And the most painful shift of the football past the upright in the Vikings' and the NFL's long history. What started with a controversial draft pick and a coach whose constant experimentation with his team finally revealed the correct formula, ended with a kicker who'd been near perfect for so long, making probably the costliest slip-up of his career. This is the story of the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. Like most NFL powerhouses, this story doesn't start right at the beginning of the season, but rather a little earlier. 6 years earlier to be more specific, with the retirement of head coach Jerry Burns and the signing of Dennis Green, a coach that had garnered respect in more than one area of the field's practice. Having bounced around from the coaching staff of a variety of colleges, Green and his offensive genius had already gotten the attention of the football world after he coached running backs under Bill Walsh in Stanford. Later, he took up the job of head coach at a flaky program at Northwestern University, building a legacy of diligence and becoming one of the only black head coaches to ever win the Big Ten Coach of the Year award in 1982. He finished his NCAA career with Stanford, and on January 10, 1992, he signed with the Minnesota Vikings. Through the next 6 seasons, the Vikings didn't have a single losing year, making the playoffs in 5 of those 6 years, although the team was becoming notorious for its inherent lack of playoff success. Green continued to build up the team in the style that he had learned under the wing of his head coach Bill Walsh at Stanford, almost paying tribute to the West Coast offense that had been coined by the 49ers of the 1980s, while putting his own spin on the way he used the pieces he'd been given. He had a knack for going all in on a player that he believed in, and is even credited for the development of Hall of Fame receiver Chris Carter, whom the Vikings had only received for $100 off waivers in 1989. However, the team had still only gotten to their divisional round once under the reign of Green, and it seemed that they were fated to be a forgotten side of the 90s era that was dominated so much by Aikman, Elway, Young, and Favre. However, the story of the 1998 season is to truly begin here, because at this stage of consistent pitfalls came one shining light that was identified by none other than Dennis Green himself. With the draft coming up that year, 32 NFL teams were prepared to plunge into the cesspool of hardship that was talent evaluation. But amongst the vast array of players looking to shoot their shot in the big leagues, Green had his eye on one specific player, a dynamic wide receiver from Marshall University by the name of Randy Moss. And just as he had advantageously decided with Chris Carter before, Dennis Green was all in on Moss. As pumped as Green might have been, we have to understand that there wasn't much belief amongst the rest of the Vikings organization that Moss would drop down far enough for the Vikings to get him. However, a drop from projections was possible due to the off-field issues that the player struggled with in college. But Green understood what Moss could do for that offense better than most. You simply couldn't throw the ball far enough for him. And after Moss's projected destination Dallas took Greg Ellis at number 8, Moss continued to drop down until fate had it that while the Vikings had the 21st pick in the NFL draft, he was still on the board. It was a no-brainer for Dennis, who'd been obsessed with this guy ever since he first laid eyes on him.
Minnesota Vikings have selected wide receiver from Marshall University, Randy Moss.
Moss was immediately called down to Florida to train with team veteran Chris Carter and submitted to a strict training regime. The result of this was a player that arrived to camp on time, a well-spoken player ready to learn from his mistakes, and a player with a strong desire to shift his focus slowly on a successful future in the NFL. And this translated to his training camp play, where his teammates were quickly shell-shocked by his sheer ability in the position that he played. Vikings starting quarterback Brad Johnson had been told that Moss could not be outthrown. So in scrimmage, he decided to run a bunch of 5-step drops and launch the ball as far as he could downfield. Moss kept catching and catching and catching. Johnson later remembered what Moss nonchalantly told him after that practice session. "I'm never running full speed unless it's Deion Sanders or Darrell Green. I'm just setting them up. Throw it out there and I'll get it." Running back Robert Smith was equally impressed, stating back then that if he had stayed healthy, he could definitely get into the Hall of Fame. Vikings tackle Todd Stussy even remembers Moss ripping apart the cornerbacks in the intra-squad scrimmage and saying that was just third gear while holding up his 3 fingers. The team was perfectly constructed around their star rookie receiver, and he'd seemingly been drafted into a team that was perfect for him. That preseason, the Vikings finished unbeaten and outscored their opponents 129-50. And finally, with OC Brian Billick masterminding what was the most anticipated offense of the year and a team ready to take on the entire league, they walked into their Week 1 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Chris Carter recalled the casual nature with which Randy Moss approached the field. Having drank a can of Coke and eaten a packet of hot tamales candy for his pregame meal, Moss made his NFL debut with 4 catches for 95 yards and 2 touchdowns, as the Vikings would go on to curb stomp their division foe Tampa on opening day 31-7. However, just as this team had been used to for all too long, adversity struck them early in Week 2, with quarterback Brad Johnson going out of the game against St. Louis with a sprained ankle, and in came a name that the NFL knew all too well. A quarterback that had come into the Vikings second string just a year ago, after having been out of the league the year before that. A player that had stunned with the Eagles as a polarizing figure of the late 80s, Randall Cunningham. Randall had been retired for a year and was initially going to sign with the Saints, but Vikings chaplain Keith Johnson flew out to his home in Las Vegas and had dinner with him. People don't know what they talked about, but I guess it worked. Randall was a Viking, and for the first time since 1995, he was stepping onto a football field to play under center. And what better way to make an entrance than to lead a game-winning drive against the St. Louis Rams to win 38-31 and take Minnesota to 2-0. Randall was perfect for the core around him, an athletic quarterback who became a typical pocket passer with all the weapons he had surrounding him. What makes this 100 times better is how much Cunningham had to prove. He wasn't seen as fit by many, including his own coaches and offensive coordinator Brian Billick. While he knew Cunningham still had the talent, he thought he wasn't ready to tap into it yet. Even so, as the weeks went by, it was getting tougher and tougher to pull Randall out. And even if head coach Dennis Green felt a sense of loyalty to Brad Johnson, he couldn't just inject a new quarterback into a system that was working so well for the Vikings. Cunningham had a rocket for an arm. He could ad-lib, scramble out of the pocket, a lot of things that many quarterbacks would struggle to do even in their prime. A lot of players and personalities involved with the fairy tale season would later recollect the pity that they shared for Brad Johnson, as he would be forced to watch the historic year unfold right in front of his eyes. Don Banks, Vikings beat writer for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, would go on to tell Sports Illustrated, "It was just lightning in a bottle." Next thing you know, Brad is on the sidelines watching this memorable season unfold. It could have easily happened the same way with Brad as the quarterback, because if anything, I think he had a better connection with Moss because they worked so closely together throughout the preseason. The culture within the camp was a sight to behold. The locker room was made of players that found strength and resilience in their faith. The focal point of this calmness amongst the players were people such as Chris Carter and Randall Cunningham himself. Dennis Green was a natural at tying together players to create one big family within the Viking organization. He knew how to handle the vast array of personalities he was presented with. There were cocky young players, experienced veterans, and even degenerate gamblers, and he was able to bring them all together. Faith in sports was often very divisive and had to be handled carefully, but here it was a way for different people to understand each other on a different level. Green used faith to inspire his players to help people around them. Robert Griffith, the Viking safety, said Denny almost made it mandatory that every guy get out in the community. We, and I want to make sure you write this in capital letters please as a personal quote, because there's not a lot of acknowledgement that goes out to Denny Green, man. Denny Green is the NFL's Community Tuesday. He started it. He did. I was there. If you were at home on Tuesday, you were reaching out on Tuesday and doing something. Going to a hospital and visiting a sick kid, or speaking at elementary schools. At the same time though, the team had lots of room for fun. It was reported that Robert Smith, the Vikings running back, and Randy Moss were the subject of races that would have bets placed on them. Even in the locker room, they would bet on who would get the first touchdown, the longest touchdown, the most yards, and so on. 2 different positions didn't matter. They just loved to get better and improve alongside one another. These players didn't just know how to have fun off the field though. On the field, they were absolute beasts. It got to a point where it was just becoming too easy for the team to churn out win after win after win. After their win in St. Louis, the Vikings would go on to win 5 straight to move to 7-0, the best start to a season in team history. Everything was looking more than perfect for a team that was moving closer and closer to the pinnacle of their stardom. Brad Johnson, while briefly coming back, would injure his thumb in Week 9 and permanently leave the field for the 1998 season. Even he would observe that this team did what they did so effortlessly. The wide receivers coach, his name was Hubbard Alexander, legendary coach, would get up to talk. Randy would tell him, "Sit down. It doesn't matter what they play. It doesn't matter who they are. We're gonna blow right by them." And so that was the scouting report. him telling the coach to sit down. The Vikings were absolutely unstoppable, and while players like Randy Moss, Chris Carter, Randall Cunningham, and Robert Smith would have gotten a larger share of the spotlight, it was the unsung heroes behind them that also had a big part to play in many games. Tackle Todd Stussy and guard Randall McDaniel are among some of the names that contributed to this high-flying offense. Vikings center Jeff Christie, who had originally been a backup kicker at Ohio State, was put into the system as center with the full backing of the head coach and a whole lot of confidence, even eventually earning himself a Pro Bowl nod. Defensive tackle John Randall would eventually come up with 10 sacks, and linebacker Ed McDaniel would pick up 7 sacks himself, while Mr. Consistent kicker Gary Anderson was having yet another fairy tale season, making all 35 of his previous field goals stretching across 2 seasons. Jake Reed, while not earning a Pro Bowl appearance that year, would easily have been a number 1 receiver on any other team he played for. The team would suffer an unfortunate 3-point loss to Central Division rivals Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 9 with the re-injury of quarterback Brad Johnson. And with the game against the Saints in Week 10 and a whole lot of doubters to silence, the Metrodome was louder than ever. The Vikings would pick up a 31-24 victory to move 8-1 on the season, and from then on, they wouldn't look back. They were near perfect, a team with high expectations and all the bells and whistles they could possibly need to fulfill those expectations. The team finished their season off with a 15-1 record, clinching the number 1 seed in the AFC, a first-round bye, and practically cementing the huge Super Bowl expectations that were placed upon them as the season continuously progressed. They rode this momentum into their first-round bye, thumping the Cardinals 41-21 in the divisional round swiftly afterwards. There was just no defense that could match up with this team. Nobody could take them on. Nobody could stop them. Well, except for, of course, themselves. The Vikings were set to host the 14-2 Atlanta Falcons in the Metrodome for the NFC Championship game, a game that should really have been a much more anticipated matchup, but in the minds of fans and players alike, there was no real doubt that the Purple People Eaters were to make short work of Atlanta. The unit was stacked on both talent and confidence, and so with that being said, the game was to commence. The Dirty Bird Falcons started with a quick-fire touchdown on their very first drive, but the Vikings were unfazed and responded with a touchdown of their own. Gary Anderson was called into action by the time the second quarter was underway and remained perfect as ever. And after another Viking touchdown off of a drive that started with a fumble recovery made the score 17-7, there was little telling that the Falcons were in for a victory. The Vikings then got up to 20-7. However, then the drive down began for the Falcons. Terrence Mathis caught a touchdown pass to make the score 20-14, and then another field goal made the score 20-17. Shortly afterward, however, Matthew Hatchett would catch another touchdown pass to bring the Falcons into a 10-point deficit early on in the fourth quarter. As they had done for so long throughout the game, though, Atlanta stayed close. Chris Chandler linked up with Tony Martin to set up a field goal, and the Falcons decreased the deficit to 27-20. But then again, the Vikings charged down the field. They pushed forward with all their might, and with 2:11 left on the game clock, Gary Anderson attempted a 39-yard field goal to try and send the Minnesota Vikings to the Super Bowl. The fairy tale season for a team that had broadened its shoulders, looking to balance the pressure of expectation that had been placed upon them. A team that was almost destined for this moment. A team that could see their entire year, a roller coaster ride of emotion, be decided by one field goal, from a kicker that hadn't missed in a couple of years. Anderson measured the center of the post with his hands and took his position.
The answer should probably be yes. 39 yards away, and it's not good.
The kick was missed and the game went into overtime, courtesy of a game-tying touchdown at the end of the fourth quarter. Then Chris Chandler and the Falcons drove down the field, forcing the Vikings to watch, helpless, unable to do anything about what they were witnessing. With each completed pass, the sick reality of what was happening to them was slowly starting to sink in. And finally, the game-winning field goal was kicked to send the Falcons to the Super Bowl and the Vikings crashing out. Brian Billick would later go on to say, "I turned my back to the field because I figured we're going to the Super Bowl. Gary hadn't missed one all year long. He was 100%. Had not missed a field goal all season. So I'm going back to the Gatorade thinking it's over. Then I hear the crowd groan, and I look up and I see we missed the field goal." Gary Anderson himself was asked about it in a phone interview, where he said, "It certainly was difficult. I took tremendous pride throughout my career about being that one guy on the team that everyone could count on in a critical situation. And that time, that particular kick, I missed the kick. So yeah, that was certainly a difficult thing to deal with." That season, that team, that time, that journey, those highs, those lows, that moment. that heartbreak. One of the toughest pills that this franchise, these fans, and any of those players had ever had to swallow. But most of all, that coach, Dennis Green. Marie Green used to give her husband 3 days to swallow every loss, 72 hours, after which she would then ask him to snap out of it. But this was different. She would go on to say that it was one of his biggest regrets before his unfortunate passing on July 21st, 2016. The juggernaut he had built, and the result he'd missed out on. Randall Cunningham would play for another 2 years before retiring in 2001. Chris Carter would retire soon after as well. Randy Moss would pick up right where he left off, but would have a few lackluster seasons before having his own career revival with Brady and the Patriots, missing out on yet another Super Bowl in crushing fashion. Gary Anderson would bring his 20-year career to a close in 2004 and would find peace in the Canadian Rockies. John Randall would finish a legendary career in 2004 and would retire with the Seattle Seahawks. And bit by bit, the team was disassembled. The team that Green had spent years building was gone. The work was gone. But they were more than a group. What defined this team was their unity, their togetherness, their companionship, the way they tied together elements of their being that should have been divisive. What defined this team was a coach who could construct them and then guide them. What defined this team was having more than one leader. We define the 1998 Minnesota Vikings on the basis of a singular play, that singular unfortunate shift of the football. But they are defined by so much more than that. The 1998 Minnesota Vikings were one kick short of the promised land, one kick short of the NFL's highest summit, and maybe even one kick short of peace. Sure, they were the team behind a painstaking loss that would leave many shell-shocked for a while, some even still so. The hole in the hearts of those that were alive to see it probably still remains for some. But this team should be remembered for more than that. Truly the greatest team to never make it.